Now, we've talked about misconceptions about weed, we've talked about its impacts, and we've talked about law and policy. And all these things are taken into account when trying to make a decision on whether to use weed and how to use it. Now, when it comes to harm, I think the natural inclination is to avoid it as much as possible, and that's natural. It's important to remember, though, that the only way to completely avoid risk or harm when it comes to weed use is abstinence, or not to use it at all. That said, we do know that there are some strategies and ways that if you choose to use weed, you can enact to at least attempt to reduce the severity of harm when it comes to cannabis use. So let's talk harm reduction. In the field of substance use, harm reduction is the approach that seeks to minimize the negative impacts of substance use, both on ourselves and the people around us. It's not harm prevention, meaning that the only way to prevent harm altogether is to abstain from using substances in the first place. But we do know there are ways and strategies to minimize the potential negative impacts substance use has to self and others. It's important to keep in mind, though, that engaging in any kind of substance use is going to come with some level of risk, from personal injury while intoxicated, all the way to legal consequences depending on the substance and circumstance. The goal isn't to convince someone that it is suddenly super safe to use or to convince someone not to. The goal is to alleviate stigma, make it okay to talk about substance use, and do what we can to stay safe to the best of our ability if you choose to use. Contrary to conducted a review of the most relevant research and strategies on ways to reduce the negative health impacts of weed use. Here are their following 12 key takeaways. For instance, the later the better. Frequent use before late adolescence is linked to adverse impacts on your brain development, social relationships, and mental health. So waiting until the body and mind has had time to develop before using weed is key if you choose to use. Over time, THC content in cannabis products, which is the content that gets you high, has increased significantly. It's important to choose lower potency cannabis products, either with low THC content or a high CBD to THC ratio, to lessen negative health outcomes from THC. Smoking cannabis has negative impacts on our heart and lungs as well. And so while any way to consume cannabis has its cons, research suggests that using alternate methods to consume weed to avoid exacerbated adverse health impacts. If you do decide to smoke cannabis, avoid holding the smoke in to your lungs or other forms of deep inhalation. The longer that smoke is present, the longer other toxic content can be present as well. Getting cannabis from legal and regulated sources is also really important, like dispensaries, because it means you can have a better sense of the potency and the content of what is consumed. Quality standards minimize the number of contaminants a cannabis product might contain. And the math is really simple. How much cannabis is consumed and how often is linked to the severity of adverse health impacts. It's important to avoid daily or near daily use, as well as to be sure to limit how much cannabis is being consumed at once, ideally sticking to no more than once or twice a week if you use at all. Cannabis use can again impair our cognitive functioning, with impacts sometimes lasting long after use is stopped. And so, if you use cannabis and notice any signs of cognitive impairments, consider taking an extended break or tea break from cannabis, or at least drastically reducing the intensity, dosage, and frequency of use. Weed can also have negative impacts on our reproductive ability, as well as postnatal outcomes for offspring and people who are pregnant. If you're planning to conceive a child, consider abstaining from weed use to reduce the risk to yourself and the infant. And avoid the mix. Using cannabis and other substances together can magnify the negative impacts of both. Avoid mixing cannabis with alcohol, tobacco, or other psychoactive substances. And if you take prescription medication and choose to use weed, be sure to consult your doctor about the potential interaction between cannabis and medication. Remember, cannabis use is linked to increased risk for the development or exacerbation of things like psychotic disorders, like schizophrenia, depression, thoughts of suicide, as well as substance use disorders. And it also increases the chance for adverse health outcomes, such as heart disease. When considering whether, how much, or how often to use cannabis, it's also important to consider things like health history, especially if those diagnoses run in the family. And lastly, the more risk factors that are present, the greater the chance and scope of adverse health impacts from weed use can be. Take some time to think about what risk factors might exist in your own life, such as the intensity of cannabis use present, family and health history, and your mental health and overall well being. And a final note on harm reduction. Anytime cannabis is used, you're taking on some extent of risk for negative health outcomes. These are keys to reduce the extent of negative impacts. But again, the only way to avoid them altogether is through abstinence. Also remember that frequent use over a long period of time can lead to cannabis dependence or a cannabis use disorder. If you or someone you know might be experiencing cannabis use disorder, help is available. Visit NAU Counseling Services for more information. And then lastly, reducing harm is not only for your own well-being, but others around you. Remember to stay aware of how your actions impact others too, and avoid doing things like exposing others to smoke or driving while impaired, because it could seriously impact not just yourself, but other members of your community.